Welcome to the World Lens podcast, where we examine what's happening around the world each week through a global business lens. I am your host, Michelle Evans, digital specialist at the World Trade Center Institute. So, before we begin, I want to inform all our listeners about a programming note. World Lens is taking a summer break. Our final episode of season 1, as we're now calling the first batch of our episodes, will air on Thursday, June 27th. Be sure to say subscribe while we're off for the summer so you'll know exactly when we come back with season 2 this fall. Now, on for today's topic. We are tackling the power grid, which is tangentially related to summer, or at least the increased temperatures and sunlight it brings. You may have seen some stories lately about California where energy generated renewables exceeded energy demand for 45 days straight. Bruce, this sounds like a good thing, but I'm seeing some concerns online. Why are people so hesitant?
So I actually work with one of the largest power producers in California for many, many years. So I've been following the evolution of renewables and this kind of environment that we're running into. So this, 45 days straight is a record. So that just
Mm-hmm.
shows the growth of renewables in that market. But what's even more impressive is that the combination of they produce renewables with wind, solar, and hydro, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that production exceeded demand on the main grid of California for 69 of the past 75 days.
Yeah, I
So
saw
it's kind
that.
of like playing Wordle, right? You might,
I love Wordle.
so you might have a 60-day, 67 or what, a 45 days straight streak, right? But you only missed 2 other days, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
really, really impressive. But yes, people are hesitant about this because it's a very dynamic and complex environment. The power grid and power generation demand, and if they essentially all the renewable production
Mm-hmm.
except hydro, but I'll come back to that in California, can be very intermittent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because solar is not producing at night, wind is
Right.
not producing when the wind flows, but even hydro that you would think would be more stable, well, when California has a drought, even
Right.
that can become unreliable, right? So you have to have backup production with natural
Mm-hmm.
gas largely to compensate when these aren't available, or you have some kind of storage capability, and which are expensive, right? So there's a very mixed blessing here as far as renewables and meeting demand, but not. And I think the other challenge that people have is that it's very heartbreaking when you're producing all this renewable energy and there's nowhere to put it, so it's just wasted.
Yeah. So California now has so many solar panels that the electricity prices sometimes go in the negative.
Yep.
Crazy. What is the practical impact of that for the consumer and on grid operators?
It's very confusing. So and I have solar on my home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very exciting when you get a negative bill, right? It's like woo.
I, I wish.
Because most of these homes that have solar panels have what are called net meters, right? So
Mm-hmm.
during the day when the solar's producing it, the meter's going backwards and subtracting, and then at night when you're drawing off the grid, it goes positive and they're drawing from the grid, and you pay on the net usage
Mm.
of power, what you push during the day into the grid versus what you pull off at night. So for homeowners or people that have, or businesses, it's exciting, but for grid operators, it's like hairy,
Mhm.
right? It's like you have all this, supply and demand variation. You have tremendous fixed capital costs in there, and so these prices, get adjusted, but not on a dynamic basis for the utility. Maybe they have rates, every year, every couple of years that they're, and then they can do what they call fuel adjustment clauses to adjust
Hmm.
during, maybe on a monthly basis. So it's a very mixed bag about, but I think for the solar owner, it's exciting.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, because when you're pulling the grid price, it's going to offset what your savings. And so you really have to look at that annual cost of electricity, not just any given day or during the
Hmm.
summer. Whereas in the winter, all those gains are, not all, but it increases the overall average cost. And so, yep.
Right. So you mentioned that it's a waste of energy. Um, what are ways that we can mitigate that waste? Like just big old home batteries? Wouldn't that mean like we're going off the grid now?
Yeah. So, just like we talked about, when supply exceeds demand, either you capture that energy or you can transmit it into other grids that don't have excess supply, right?
Hmm.
And or you can store it, right?
Okay.
So for a home, you can store it in batteries, right? And there's all kinds of people out in the market that will slap batteries and into your house, and you can do that. But when I looked at that, it was about fifteen to $18,000 to have a battery bank that would store the power to run the home, over a longer period, not just during the night, but you might have cloudy, rainy weather for 5, 6, 7 days, right?
Right.
And anyway, so that's a huge capital cost, right? So it's a lot easier to throw solar panels up, have a net meter, and be done, right?
Hmm.
And so you're not really going off the grid. You're really, you're relying on the grid to cover you,
Yeah.
right? So
So could we retrofit or upgrade like the existing power grid to help control the new flow of power? So for example, could we divert energy from communities that have like so much of it to those who don't?
yeah, and that's what I was just saying, that ideally you would take this excess production, right, supply,
Hmm.
and move it to areas that need it. But this is part of like working in this market. Our power distribution, the grid infrastructure is abhorrent. um, I look at what they suffer with. A lot of this stuff is 50 and 60 years old,
Yeah.
right? And and just and really hasn't been upgraded. So all everything that's been out there has been to, we've got to get more modern transmission capacity to move energy around more efficiently and reliably than we have on the existing infrastructure. And people, and it's actually quite simple. It's like, solar power, produces electrons and pushes it into the transmission, right? And transmits those electrons somewhere. So when I explain this to people, I said it's no different than water,
Hmm.
right? So if I'm producing, pumping a well and producing water, and I have a big pipe, then I can move that water efficiently from point A to point B. But then if I want to distribute that, if I have a small little hose and that's all I have, then that big pipe, all the water, is just goes on
Yeah.
the ground, except for what little bit
The
goes into
bit
that
goes in
little
that
hose.
hose.
That's what we're dealing
Hmm.
with, right?
Mm.
And so we need bigger hoses. We need, lots of more smaller hoses. We've got to invest in transmission capacity and storage technology if we're going to solve this in the long run.
So, federal regulators recently approved a new rule that makes transmitting renewable energy to the electric grid easier. How does that impact everything we've talked about so far?
How does it impact it? It gives us hope. So FERC, we call it lovingly, right? The Federal
Mm-hmm.
Energy Regulatory Commission actually just passed this month, I think. Yeah, this month, earlier this
Yeah.
month. Rule number was 1920 because it's easy to remember that date. But that uh, rule marks for like the first time in more than a decade that FERC has actually looked at this whole issue of transmission capacity into a very, I think this thing I'm going to say is over 1,000 pages, this rule. It's huge.
Wow.
But what it's doing is it squarely is addressing the need for long term, like 20-year horizon transmission planning for the grid. The reason that this is so complicated is we so easily just say the grid. Okay.
Yeah.
The US national power grid is a morass of I think we have like 10 independent operators just within the four lower 48 states, kind of at this generating. There's like 10,000 power plants in California. I think there's like, I'm going to say 40 to 50 or companies that have some responsibility for power generation or transmission within that state alone. So
Hmm.
what you have here, and what it's lovingly referred to as the most complicated machine that man has ever, or humans have ever built, is the national grid of all these systems of systems that it actually works.
Hmm.
So it's it's really challenging, and so if we have to invest in transmission so we can move this around, we need to upgrade the systems, and unfortunately all that comes at a cost that gets folded into bills, and customers aren't happy, people don't want transmission lines in their backyard, and on and on and on.
Yeah. So one of the phrases that kept coming up during the research for this topic is that our power grid is at a make or break moment. You mentioned how it's like old. Is it due to age, population growth? Like what do they mean?
Yeah, that's, I guess, what I'm trying to highlight here is that,
Mm-hmm.
we have a very complicated system. It's being powered now by not stable, reliable energy that's being produced by, gas, coal. Uh, it's you have all these kind of intermittent supplies that are coming and going during the day and those kinds of things. So it's a much more kind of dynamic. Demand is going out the roof,
Mm-hmm.
elect EV vehicles, and everything that we have has, is being powered by electricity. Data centers are, increasing their demand because of AI and compute resources. And so it's just it right now it's tenuous at best, and we've seen major blackouts in the United States already. We haven't even gotten into the peak of summer,
Yeah.
and demand's growing, supplies there, but we can't move it, right?
Mm.
So uh, yeah, so I think we're going to have to make some substantial investments more quickly than we really would like to.
Yeah. Before we started recording, I mentioned Texas, and it reminds me of all the failures they had with their energy grid during a recent cold, like winter.
Mhm.
Like, what will it take to weatherize our grid?
I think probably through that, many people know that Texas is an outlier. The lone star state. It's also the lone power grid state. So they are this, and it's called the I love it because it's like Electric Reliability Council. ERCOT is the company that, the organization that runs this thing. But anyway, so it's essentially an island to itself.
Hmm.
They don't know how to spell cold, right? So they weren't prepared with having these weatherized facilities and things for that kind of
Right.
cold. And I think the number, as I recall, it was in the billions. I don't know, $5 to $20 billion to winterize all the plants just in Texas, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so that's what it's going to take, a lot of money. Back to my original comment, we're
Right.
going to have to spend a lot more money than we think we're going to have to spend if we're going to have reliable energy for the society that we envision in the next 5 years, let alone the next 20.
Yeah. So there's a lot of political challenge when it comes to
Yeah.
these energy grids. Some states have embraced this transition to renewable energy and others have not. But when it comes to the power grid, states that may not agree are tied together, aren't they?
So Texas is an outlier, right?
Yeah.
Most of the operators have interconnect agreements, right, so that they can share and pull power from other grids if they need it, if they have excess demand or not enough supply. And so that goes on in that. But I hopefully it's what we're hopefully hope people are hearing here is it's not simple.
Yeah.
It's not simple, right? So why should one you know area of the country spend huge amounts of money, right, to upgrade their environment, and then the grids around them are all lagging, right? So now they're pulling power from the people that have invested to their benefit and didn't invest, right, or vice versa, right? And obviously with all the renewables, so it's a real political hot potato. It's really political when you start talking about putting high voltage transmission lines, not in my backyard. So it is a contentious issue, and it's not a monolithic. We have local laws, state laws, federal
Right.
laws. So every operator is under different kind of jurisdiction and different profiles. So it is a real challenge, and
Big call.
I think if we are going to solve it in the long run, we're they're talking about right now like having like four or five regional structures to kind of start taking out some of this complexity.
Okay.
That would be a good start.
So let's look into our crystal ball. Is there any chance of some kind of significant power grid failure in the future? And if so, how do we prepare for that?
Well, we talked about coronal mass ejection on a previous
Yes.
podcast, so the answer is yes. The chance of that is non-zero. It may be very small, but if we had another, Carrington level event, we could blow out the whole North American power grid structure. Done, right? So yes, and that's a one and done. Then we'd be cooking on
Mm-hmm.
gas camp stoves, right? But but given setting that aside, that's like aliens coming. Um, the distributed nature of what I've talked about, all these independent operators and all this, distributed production stuff actually does create a highly resilient national grid, right? So having the concept of a national grid failure, other
Mm-hmm.
than something, you know, like a CME or some crazy thing, is virtually nil because you have this. Now these localized blackouts are real and they're increasing. And so here's a fun fact: between 2000 and 2023, so 23-year period, right?
Mm-hmm.
Texas, for the reasons that we said, because they're sitting there as they're alone, leads the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. in the number of major blackouts during that period. 264 major blackouts.
Yikes.
That's
Wow.
more than 10 per year, right? So that's just Texas, right? So what we're seeing is that in now with all the dynamic weather and extremes and all those kinds of things, that the frequency and scope of blackouts are on the rise, right?
Yeah.
And trust me, California is not far behind. I think they're like in the 200 range over that
Oh,
period. So
wow.
it's not. But anyway, so the point is that yes, we will see power grid failures, but they will be localized, not a national grid failure. maybe,
Okay.
could be large, like we had the whole Northeast one period, just cascaded through the various, grids connections, the interconnects and things, and we had a whole kind of Northeast regional blackout. That's very possible. But anyway, so yes, short answer.
So, are you feeling positively or negatively about the direction the grid is going?
If you say the grid itself, I'm clearly negative. It's an aging horse, right? Given some of the actions and obviously the NERC, you know, ruling making on transmission gives me some hope. If we
Mm-hmm.
can get through political, hurdles and come together and make these upgrades that are desperately needed, then I'm more hopeful. Absolutely.
Okay. I mean, I like to be an optimist, so I'm going to say that I'm hopeful. But, realism kicks in every once in a while.
Yeah, so we will have to endure
Mm-hmm.
more blackouts in the near future because this, transmission line, installing those does not happen overnight, months, or it'll take years, right?
Yeah,
So we're going to endure that, and then that will raise everyone's desire to get it fixed, which will put more pressure and open the gates to getting it done.
nice. Well, as always, Bruce, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, now we get to take the summer off and see what happens, right?
Yes. And of course, thank you all for tuning in. Please visit the World Trade Center Institute online at WTCI.org for more insights, events, and opportunities. And make sure you follow us on all social channels at WTC Institute. See you next week.